Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
I'm Tali Rosenbaum, and we're here recording an introduction to our episode that we actually recorded before the war.
That episode was supposed to be our season premiere. We recorded it a little bit before Sukkot, if I recall. Because of the war and all of the things that have happened since then, it simply didn't at first seem to make any sense to release an episode about female desire. And yet, Tali, today we're doing so nonetheless.
It's kind of the beginning of a two-part episode where we're talking about desire discrepancies and trying to understand more about the differences between female and male desire. But I'll tell you, we really debated when to begin releasing the episodes that we recorded before the war. Our whole lives are about the war. And when we first did an episode, it was only about a week after the war started, if we go back to our intimacy during wartime episode. And I think we were still both pretty shell-shocked when we recorded that episode. I still think that a lot of the things that we said then are relevant. So anybody who hasn't yet heard it, we highly recommend that you go back and listen to that episode. But I feel like now we need to do a follow-up, which I think we should record and perhaps release soon, a bonus episode. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think it's important. There's still a lot to talk about. It happens to be that most of our listeners are not in Israel, although we do have some Israeli listeners. The majority of our audience is outside of Israel. Nevertheless, the entire Jewish world is struggling with this. There's a very big discrepancy, that's our word today, between the way that people in Israel are dealing with it and those outside of Israel. Everyone is emotionally caught up, but it's very different when your own children are serving in the army, when you're hearing sirens at night. So obviously, there are differences. At the same time, I think this will be important for everybody. Tali, it's interesting you say shell-shocked. I think back to an Orthodox conundrum that you and I released literally a day or two after October 7th. I had you on as a guest on that podcast that I also host. It's funny because one of the quotes you said there almost offhand was there was before and then there's after. And to me, I was thinking, okay, yeah, October 7th was before and October 8th is after. And now that we're almost 2 months in, I realized that, as you told me afterwards, that's not really true. It was all still before. I don't know what after looks like. We weren't nearly at the after at that point. After is going to take a while before we get there. When you say shell-shocked, that's what I think about.
Absolutely. When we talk about the first few days and what's going to happen, now we're 2 months in and looking at what happened and what's happened. And this is universal. It's not only in Israel. There is a coming together of the Jewish people, everybody wanting to help, everybody wanting to fight the fight, so to speak, in the way that they can do it. And in a way, I think that we here at Intimate Judaism also have our role. I think that one of the things that we're trying to do is help couples connect. And we don't really have a lot of data yet on what happens to couples and what happens in intimacy and sexuality during acute, prolonged stress of wartime. We have a lot of information about post-traumatic stress and its effect on sexuality and intimacy. And I think we've spoken about it. But my theory is, and I think we have to gather the data, that when we're under prolonged stress, we do want to look for resources and connection, affiliation, togetherness, certainly as a community, volunteering together. I have a bunch of different WhatsApp groups that we're working on different things together, but also the connection with your partner. So our work in Intimate Judaism, which is really about intimacy, I think is so important now more than ever, because really intimacy is the opposite of trauma. It's connection. It's feeling safe with another person when trauma is so much about not feeling secure and not feeling safe.
That's a really interesting idea, that intimacy and trauma are at polar opposites. I never thought of it that way. I think that I would suggest to our listeners, if you have topics that you would like us to address regarding any of the trauma that any of us are going through that you think needs to be addressed, please let us know. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com, because we want to hear from you. We want to know what you want to hear about, because there are a number of wonderful organizations that have been putting out various programs and podcasts that are dealing with wartime and halakha, and I highly recommend that you look around and find them, because there's a lot of interesting work that's being done by them, and it's very worthwhile. And if you'd like to hear the Intimate Judaism perspective on some of these same issues or on different issues, please let us know.
Yeah, wartime, sexuality, intimacy, and trauma, and also halakha, and we will talk about those in our bonus episode. We are also dealing with here the terrible disappointment of women's rights organizations, the UN, sexual health organizations that have failed to condemn Hamas. And this has also been an area that many of us here have been very busy with.
I hope that explains successfully the context in which this episode was originally recorded and the reason that we're releasing it now. So without further ado, here is the episode that we recorded about 2 months ago. Today, we have a very interesting topic. Why don't you introduce it?
Well, we're going to talk about the idea of sexual desire and the idea of couples experiencing discrepancies in desire. This is a very common topic that gets raised.
We'll get to that conversation in just a moment. First, check out the website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts. Rate and review, and please leave a comment as well. Tell people about Intimate Judaism, and share this podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Also, make sure to visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and talirosenbaum.com. Now, today, Tali, a lot of the burden of talking about this particular topic is going to fall on you because this is an area where you have expertise and I don't. I do want to open up with a Ma'amar Chazal, a very well-known one that appears in Masechet Ketuvot, Daf Memchet Amud Aleph, 48a. It says, Tani Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef taught, She'era zo kiruv basar. The word she'era, which appears in Chumash, referring to an obligation that a husband has to his wife, refers to closeness of the flesh, in other words, sexual relations. Shlein hagba min hag parsiyim, which means that a husband is not allowed to act towards his wife like the Persians. What does that mean? Shemishamshin mitothem bilvoshehen, where they have intercourse while they're dressed. Messiah le Rav Huna. This supports Rav Huna. Da'ama Rav Huna, as Rav Huna said, Ha'omer efshi ela ani b'bigdi v'hi b'bigda. I do not want to have sex unless both my wife and I are clothed. Yotzi v'noten ketuvah. We tell him he should get divorced and give her the full ketuvah, which is another way of saying the burden is on him. It's his mistake. He's wrong to ask for that. Now, in some ways, this is sort of obscure, but I think it's quite clear if we look at what it's talking about. And this is also certainly the halacha as well, the Jewish legal reality, that a husband has an obligation to his wife to give her sexual pleasure. It's not enough for them simply to have sexual intercourse for the sake of being fruitful and multiplying, pru urvu. It's not enough because of mitzvat ona. He actually has an obligation to give her physical pleasure as well. And that means obviously desire of the woman and presumably of the man as well, but we're speaking about the female today primarily. Her desire is actually a halachic requirement. That's clear from this Gemara as well as I said from the halacha. So with that introduction, Tali, I just wanted to point that out, that what we're talking about today is not merely an important fact in people's sexual lives, but actually something which is mandated by the Torah too. Given that, can I ask you at the very beginning, it's sort of a very introductory question, but can you actually define the word desire in the context of what we're talking about?
That's a great question. I think that until today, the word desire conjures up a lot of different meanings. Sexual desire, it's something that a lot of us don't really understand what it is meant to be. When we see desire, when we see it on TV in the movies, we see a man and a woman who basically can't keep their hands off of each other. And so this idea of desire is often put together with the beginning of a relationship, attraction. We're wired to kind of connect with a person, and sex drive is very much associated with the idea of desire. We desire sex like we would desire food, like we would desire water, like we would desire oxygen. So that's one aspect of desire, this kind of biological drive. Another aspect of desire is more cognitive or motivational. We're motivated to seek pleasure. We're motivated to seek satisfaction. And so we're motivated by drive or desire, but sometimes it's even more from a cognitive place. I know that this is a good thing to do. I know it's good for me. I know it's good for us. And so when we talk about sexual desire, we're talking about both the cognitive desire, and we're also talking about the biological drive. So I hope that answers your question. It's a good question because the ideas around sexuality, the labels, we talk about desire and we talk about arousal and we talk about orgasm. So this idea of desire being distinctly different than arousal that also needs to be spoken about. What is arousal? Does arousal come before desire? Does desire come first? Is arousal also cognitive, or is arousal completely a biological experience? And is it in the whole body, or is it just in the genitals? It's so hard to define, but I think it's something that we all know when we're feeling it.
Okay, there are numerous things I want to ask you about that. But the first thing is, could you more specifically describe that difference between desire and arousal and orgasm? Because you mentioned these three words being very similar and we need to know what they are. So could you actually speak it out and say in a general sense? Obviously, this probably is something you could do a PhD on, but for our listeners today, what is really the difference between those three terms?
There is a lot of literature on this. I think if we go back to the history of sexology, we can first look back to the 1940s and 50s, to the founders of modern sexology, Masters and Johnson. And they're really the ones who defined these distinct phases of first desire, which is that feeling of wanting to be sexual, and then kind of experiencing arousal through engagement. That kind of increase in physiological arousal builds up until the point of orgasm. And the thing about Masters and Johnson is they looked at this pretty similarly in males and in females, except for the differences is that women took longer to go from arousal to orgasm, but they kind of believe that desire in males and in females were the same, and that people choose to engage in sexual activity out of spontaneous desire. However, the science and the understanding of desire has changed over the past several decades. And so after the work of Masters and Johnson, many women would kind of fall into this space, and many of their partners would also kind of pathologize them for not having this spontaneous desire. In fact, the movies in Hollywood gives us the impression that in order to have sex, you have to begin from a place of spontaneous desire and be ready and willing to go and just really being in the mood. Later studies, specifically Rosemary Basson, who looked specifically at women's sexual desire, have looked at the importance of responsive desire, that close to 70% of women don't necessarily choose to engage in sex because of a spontaneous libido, but rather they can be responsive to the idea of sex once the arousal kicks in, or once their cognitive motivation kicks in. We kind of touched on this in our episode on consent. I want, I will, I should, I must. And we talked kind of about those. The other thing I want to say about desire is that it's very much a function of a system which isn't linear, but rather it's kind of like driving a car. A car has a system of brakes and a car has a system of gas. Have we spoken about this before, Scott, about the car?
That particular metaphor you've mentioned, yes.
I've mentioned that before. Okay. And so the first person really to talk about the system of inhibitors and facilitators was Bancroft, really. But later on, it's been popularized by, well, Michael Perelman did a lot of work on this. And most recently, this is a name that most people have heard of, Emily Nagoski, who wrote the book Come As You Are. So in her book, Come As You Are, she's really much popularized that idea of knowing what your brakes are, knowing what inhibits you, knowing what kind of keeps your foot on the brakes pedal and doesn't kind of let you get into the experience of wanting sex, getting aroused, allowing yourself to enjoy it. And also knowing what are the facilitators, what are the things that kind of help you get going in terms of relaxing, because relaxation is a very, very important part of allowing yourself to be open to and want and agree to an experience of sex.
Okay, one of the things that I think a lot of people would wonder is based on something that you mentioned a few minutes ago, the way that we often look at sexual desire the same way we look at being hungry or a desire for oxygen you gave as an example, that it's just natural. It's not something you have to be taught, that if you want it, then you want it. Most people understand that if you're hungry, you eat. If you're not hungry, you don't eat, but you'll eventually be hungry. So when it comes to sex, often when people don't have that desire, they assume there must be something wrong in their relationship. So my first question is this: is that true? If people, a husband or a wife, A wife may say, I love my husband, but I don't really have a desire for sex with him. Does that mean that there is actually a flaw in the relationship that needs to be fixed? Or is it possible that she simply doesn't enjoy sex and that's okay? When I say okay, meaning there's nothing wrong, there's no problem that needs to be addressed here, assuming the husband is okay with it as well.
So first of all, if there is a sexual discrepancy, it's important to normalize it. I mean, people have different levels of being sexual, of wanting sex, of being kind of connected to their own sense of themselves sexually. And let's be honest, if we're talking about young couples who are newly married, they have not been encouraged necessarily to develop a sense of curiosity or certainly not a sense of experience around sex. And so the whole idea of sex is new. So this idea that the sex drive should just kick in, it's not that it doesn't. There is a wired in desire in humans for sexuality. However, there are a lot of different things that can come along and create the breaks. And so certainly relationship issues are one of those things. However, if there's a problem with sex in a marriage, it does not necessarily mean that there are relationship issues. But when there are problems around sex in a marriage, it certainly can cause relationship issues. And also the way that the relationship organizes around these problems are going to be interesting for me as a therapist to explore. The relationship is always something that needs to be explored, but we can't go from the default that, oh, the reason why there are sexual problems is because of the relationship. I mean, the truth is that people can be in a really good relationship and have some sexual problems for reasons that don't have to do with the relationship, but have to do with other factors, because there are individual psychological factors, there are physical factors, there are social and cultural factors that are not necessarily relational. What's more likely is that if there are relational issues, then the sex can suffer. So there might not necessarily be any sexual functioning issues, but whether or not there's a lot of great motivation or desire to engage in sex when there are relational problems, that's a whole other story, and that would be explored in therapy. And so what I wanted to kind of talk about today was more this idea of let's put aside the relationship factors, because relationship factors such as security, attachment styles are really important to explore. The dynamics in a relationship, those are really important to talk about. And I want to be able to have an episode where we do talk about that, where we talk about attachment styles. When I talk about attachment styles, I'll explain them when we talk about them, but there's the securely attached, the avoidant attached, the anxious attached. We're going to talk about those attachment styles when we talk about sex in relationships and the sexual dynamics and relationship dynamics. Today, what I was hoping to talk more about is just more having to do with the very common presentation of, but I love my husband. He's great. We're not even having so many issues, but why don't I desire having sex with him in the same frequency that he wants it? And the reason why I've gendered it this way is because that's a more common presentation. But I do want to say from the get-go that we definitely see where there might be a higher desire partner who is the woman. And that certainly should be talked about because there are some of the same issues there, but also some different issues. There's a lot more stigma and shame involved in being the male who wants less sex than the female. And so that's also something that needs to be talked about. So yeah, I do want to be able to kind of, what I would say, isolate that variable. We can't completely isolate it, but I want to be able to put that aside a little bit so that we can focus on some of the other variables that have to do with why couples are not having the kind of sex that they would want to have.
Okay, then let's open up this particular part of the conversation with some of those variables, some of the impediments. Can we start with physical impediments, Tali? Maybe we can discuss some of the physical reasons why a wife may not want to have as much sex as the husband does, even as she says that relationally they're very much in love.
Well, look, for the woman, I mean, there's always the whole hormonal shift, which can be something that can change throughout the month. And when we talk about the mikvah, that ideally comes out during the time of ovulation, which is supposed to be at the highest peak of desire, but there are issues that can certainly get in the way of that. Certainly birth control pills, which can affect sexual desire because of how they interact with the body's free testosterone. Other sorts of life cycle female related issues like breastfeeding, certainly infertility is a big one. We have 2 whole episodes on how infertility affects sexuality, pregnancy loss, being premenstrual, issues such as diabetes, high blood pressure, chronic stress, having a chronic illness, anything having to do with physical pain, whether it's genital pain, which for sure is going to affect desire, but even muscular pain or aches and pains, joint pain. There are a lot of physical issues which can affect desire in women and certainly in men as well. And fatigue is a huge one, just being tired, taking care of kids and work, and just being able to find the time to connect with your own self. That's also a very big factor in having a decreased desire.
Tali, you mentioned Nida, the monthly cycle, a woman getting her period, as one of the factors. I actually want to quote a Gemara from Nida Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Bet, page 31b, which has been quoted many times, especially among Kiruv professionals. It's a well-known Gemara. It says, Tanya, it's a Braita, Hayat Rabbi Meir Omer. Rabbi Meir used to say, B'nei ma amra Torah, Nida l'shiva. Why did the Torah say that a woman is forbidden to her husband for 7 days? Nowadays, it's actually about 12 or more days. But according to Torah law, without getting into all the details, it's more or less 7 days. Let's leave that for now. Why does the Torah say that a woman is forbidden to her husband for 7 days when she becomes a nida? Because the husband becomes accustomed to her. Vikatzba, and I'm not quite sure how to translate that, kind of gets sick of her, dismisses her, I guess is the best way to translate that. Amra Torah, because of that fear, of that physical sexual fear that the husband will get tired of her, so to speak, on a sexual level, the Torah said, Tehei tme'ah shiva yamim, the woman should become forbidden to her husband for 7 days. Kidei shitei chaviva abala kishat knisata l'chuppah, so that she will again be desired by her husband, just like she was when she went into the chuppah, when they got married originally. My question to you is, this is an Agadita. It's a very well-known Agadita. It's a not legal piece of the Gemara, and I'm not questioning the legal reality, of course. There are Agaditas on both sides of the aisle when we look at it. So I want to ask you if this Agadita is actually in line with what modern research has suggested about what Nida can do. In other words, is what Rabbi Meir says, does that anticipate modern research that yes, indeed, the Gemara actually says for the husband, not for the wife, but does it cause a couple to reinvigorate their physical relationship? Or is that not necessarily what research shows?
Well, the Agadita is interesting because it's talking about the male desire. Rav Chisda and his daughters, he also, when he talks about giving guidance to his daughters, he talks about making yourself more desirous for your husband. A lot of times the idea here is that the women are ready, willing, and able, and the men need to kind of come up with desire. And this is how women can help the men come up with a desire. And actually having this separation is another way for men to come up with enough desire. And even the Gemara that you had brought up about the different professions. And if you're in a physically demanding profession, you don't have to fulfill the mitzvah as frequently as if you're sitting and learning, which you have to fulfill more frequently. They all kind of give the impression that it's not the template for men to want as much as women. That's just interesting in and of itself, because this idea of the women wanting less seems to be a more modern construct than how the Talmud tends to portray it. But when you ask the question about, does modern science show that this is actually the case? Modern science doesn't really study that particular Agadita, but what I would look at studying would be some of the more contemporary Jewish literature. So, for example, we were talking before about The Hedge of Roses by Rabbi Lamb and other sorts of, Bibles of Taharat HaMishpacha, which say that keeping Taharat HaMishpacha really is the formula for enhancing sexual pleasure for both men and women, because when you create a separation, that creates desire. And I think that for the most part, that makes a lot of sense. I don't think that anybody would argue that absence makes the heart grow fonder. I think we've talked about this before as well. We did do a study because we were seeing a lot of religious couples that despite having the nida in place, there still were a lot of issues having to do with desire. So I would say that while ideally taharat mishpacha could certainly create a situation where it is sexually positive in marriage. I think that it's only one variable amongst so many other variables. And so those variables, by the way, they can go from the most technical. When I say technical variables, I'm talking about things like basic education, not knowing the basic anatomy, not knowing about arousal and foreplay, not knowing where the clitoris is located, things like being put off by your partner's bad breath or body odor, things like not even realizing that you should shower before if your partner wants it. I mean, there's so many basic things. People don't have to go to sex therapy for these very basic psychoeducational tips to what could make you desire more. That's one whole area that we can certainly talk about. But past that, I think we also have to be able to ask the right questions. Very often, couples will come in and the higher desire partner will say, assuming it's the man, there's something wrong with my wife. She doesn't want sex. She's a prude. And she'll turn to him and she'll say, well, you're just a sex addict. No matter how much sex I give you, you're not happy. It's not enough for you. You want more. And I think that when we look at that dynamic, and sex therapists will frequently see this dynamic, I think it's really important to understand that your couple has fallen into a trap, and we don't want to fall into that trap of pathologizing our partner. If a person wants to have sex, that's great. It's great that your partner wants to have sex with you. It doesn't make them a sex addict. What we want to do is be able to acknowledge for them and validate for them. It's really nice that you want to have sex with me. I like it that you want to have sex with me. And for the partner who is the higher desire partner who feels very badly that his wife doesn't want it as often as he does, well, he needs to learn to not take that as a personal rejection, but rather to understand that some people don't want to have sex as often. And I think what happens is that couples fall into, and again, we're getting kind of a little bit into the relational dynamics, but I'll just put out there that what happens is there is a understanding that sex is something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what happens is that when we understand it that way, both partners start to avoid intimacy. The male partner, the higher desire partner, will avoid intimacy because he doesn't want to get rejected. And the female partner will avoid intimacy because in her mind, if she asks for a hug, or if she says something nice, or if she gives her husband a kiss or flirts with him anyway, that means that they've just gone into this, I can't stop it. I can't
There are no
stop.
breaks.
There are no breaks. Like once I started, I can't stop it. And I think that if you ask me what is the top reason that couples get into this kind of stuck place, is because of that. It's because of that fear that once I start, I can't stop. And this is a cultural message. It's a cultural message in Western society and in the movies. And it's also a cultural message in our culture, which tells us that once you've started, you have to go all the way. And once we change that messaging, because what that messaging does is it creates a great deal of anxiety. One of the biggest reasons that desire is decreased is because of anxiety, is because of a feeling that I'm going to lose control. And so by being able to restore that feeling of control, by being able to take the pressure off, if you said to me, Scott, I think that you can go on this helicopter and I'm going to give you a parachute. And once you jump, that's it. There's no going back. I think I would be terrified and I wouldn't do it. But if you said to me, at any moment, you can press this button and it'll just catapult you back into the plane, I might try it. I might feel like this might be cool. I might be willing to take that risk. But if I didn't have that button to press, I don't think I could do it. I think I would be too terrified. And so I think that's what happens when we educate, or when the guidance is, this is what you do on your wedding night, and this is what you do when you have sex. And there isn't a lot of talk just about the fluidity of intimacy, of touch, of also valuing the different kinds of touch, that there is nurturing touch, that there is relaxing touch, that there is some amount of comforting touch, intimate touch, and also erotic touch. And they're fluid and they don't have to begin a certain way and then end with intercourse.
Okay, that is so interesting what you just said, and I really like that metaphor with the helicopter. And I think I'd be scared of the catapult also back. That doesn't sound like so much fun either.
Yeah, that would be scary too.
Okay, but I get what you're trying to say. I do want to speak more about education that you just referenced in a minute. But before we get there, because you talked about some of the non-physical reasons, and again, avoiding by and large the relational issues, what are some of the emotional issues? You mentioned anxiety. What are some other emotional issues that can impede and stop or prevent desire?
Well, there's a lot of emotional issues. I think anxiety is probably the biggest one, but certainly just not really having a sense of yourself sexually, not having a sense of your body and how it works, being disconnected from your body, certainly having had, look, I'll put it this way. What you need to be able to relax and let go and enjoy sex is a sense that you can let go. And if you can't let go, and there are different reasons why somebody might not be able to let go, whether it's a history of trauma or whether it's anxiety or whether it's OCD or whether it's a need for control. If you can't let go, it's going to be very hard to enjoy sex. Other emotional issues may have to do, again, with what we talked about before, attachment styles. If you're avoidantly attached, if you fear intimacy, if you are uncomfortable with that level of closeness, if you have guilt or shame around sex, if you're, I don't know, like getting more psychodynamic or psychoanalytic, if you are overly identified with your mother who didn't enjoy sex, or if she's divorced. There's so many different levels of emotional breaks that can conflict with the ability to enjoy sex. So I'm glad that you asked about these individual factors. They are definitely very important to explore. There's so many to talk about. But I also want to say that even before we go into that, I think that sometimes we don't ask the most basic questions. We ask women, why don't you want? But we don't really ask women, well, what is it that you do want? What happens is that sometimes women will say to me, I don't want to have sex, but it's also because the sex is boring. I mean, I think that the sex has to be worth having in order to want it. And the idea that women necessarily like sex in a certain way, everyone likes it different. Everyone likes it differently. And so some people might not be communicating to each other very well the kind of sex that they would want to have. Maybe she wants it to have more vitality to it. Maybe she wants to try a kink and nobody's asked her that, or she's been too ashamed to ask for that. And so I think that we also have to be able to ask the right questions. Maybe she does desire, but she desires something different. Also, I think it's this going back to this idea of thinking that you have to have this spontaneous drive in order, this idea that you have to be completely in the mood. And again, this idea that you don't need to necessarily start out with a great deal of, oh my goodness, I have to do this now, but you need to be open to it. And you need to be open to the idea of motivation, looking for intimacy, looking for connection, and knowing that when the arousal kicks in, then the desire will kick in as well. The other thing, going back to some of the technical stuff, I just need to say this is that, people don't necessarily get this information. It does take longer for women. If you have been educated the way that many couples are educated about sex, especially by not such well-trained kala instructors or hatan instructors, the training kind of goes according to the template of the male model. This is how you do it. This is how you put the penis in the vagina. This is, when the male gets erect, that's when you can put the penis in the vagina. And when he's finished, he's finished. For decades, I think that there has been very little discussion about sexual templates that's not just about male oriented to their functioning, but also knowing that women also have their journey of arousal, and arousal is a full body experience, but there's also a genital experience, and that when her body is ready, then she is ready. People think sometimes that it's all in the intercourse. Many women enjoy intercourse. Some women have orgasms with intercourse. Many more women would have orgasms with intercourse if intercourse weren't so quick. What happens to many couples is they get into this pattern of thinking, okay, first we'll do me, and then we'll do you. And the intercourse will be you, and just do it quickly because anyway, it doesn't do anything for me. And that's a shame, because the truth is that the longer intercourse can last if you can get into the right position and you can be relaxed in it. Intercourse itself can be extremely pleasurable. Do you have to have orgasms with intercourse? Absolutely not. Do you have to have orgasms at the same time? Absolutely not.
Okay, Tali, we'll come back to some of the practical ways that a couple can address these discrepancies soon. Before we get there, because you already mentioned the Khatan teacher and the Kala teacher, can you talk about what sorts of educational messages we need to impart, perhaps even before a couple is ready to get married, but certainly when they're ready to get married? And part of the reason this is a little bit tricky is that in certain Orthodox communities, there isn't very much time. It could be that the Khatan and Kala get engaged and they're getting married 2, 3, 4 months later. The Kala teacher or the Khatan teacher is only going to have a certain number of hours, and at least according to the normal template, the main thing they're teaching is the laws of Hilchot Nida, the laws of Taharat Mishpacha. To get into some of the other issues that you mentioned, the importance of desire, how to have arousal, how it works for each member of the couple, these are very important things that they have to learn, but time is a big factor and there may just not be enough of it. So given that problem, what would you suggest that we add to the curriculum, so to speak, of a Khatan teacher and a Kala teacher that's not there now?
Well, one thing that I would change and add is this idea that men need sex and women need to provide it. And that is something that is almost a standard message. We've had many different podcasts addressing it, but here's what I want to say. It isn't true that men want sex that women don't like. The truth is that men don't want sex that their wives are not enjoying. And this is a really, really important message, because when I would teach Kala instructors and I would talk about the importance of taking time, learning each other, not going so quickly into sex the first night, when I would talk about the importance of autonomy and of consent and of boundaries and of fluidity and of being able to stop when you're not in the mood anymore and don't want to continue, what the college teachers would say to me was, but wait, that's a problem. That's a really big problem, because what's the man going to do? And obviously, the concern is that there would be ejaculation outside of the vagina unless the woman was willing to provide that vagina to her husband when he needs it. And here's the thing, men don't want that. They don't want a parking spot in order to ejaculate when their wife is not interested, when they don't want it. When I say this in therapy, the men nod their heads up and down. Exactly. That's what I've been trying to tell her. I don't want to do it that way. She'll say, just do what you have to do. Do it quickly. Do it even if it hurts. Or by the way, if it hurts, you're never going to have desire. Like, there's no way you're going to have desire for sex or for intercourse, especially if it hurts every time. That's not going to happen, and it shouldn't hurt. But this idea that men are willing, that men would want to have sex, or the fact that men are pursuing sex, that they'd be willing to take those scraps. They call them crumbs. They talk about it in the clinic. They'll say, I have to take crumbs and I don't want to take crumbs. And when they're talking about the crumbs, it's kind of like being able to eat the crumbs off the floor when everybody's had a nice meal. And that's what they feel like. And so this idea that you're doing your husband a favor by having sex with him, even when you don't want it, that's not true. It's not good for anybody. And that's an important message. The message has to be that there is a journey here for both partners to experience sex. And let's, instead of talking about sex in terms of function, in terms of going from the beginning to the end, let's talk about sex in terms of meaning. What is the meaning of sex for you? And most men will say it's not about being able to ejaculate. Most men will say it's about being loved. It's about being seen. It's about being cared about. It's about being noticed. It's about getting attention from my wife. That is the chiddush that I'm trying to bring here, that I don't know if it's strongly enough promoted in premarital classes. I hope that it is more and more today as there's more awareness.
Okay, but let me push back just a little bit, even though obviously I think that's a wonderful and very important, a crucial message. At the same time, that can't be the only thing we teach them aside from the halachot of nida. There's got to be more that you think, Tali, that we should be trying to teach the Chatan and Kala before the time comes up. In other words, what other sorts of things about desire specifically, meaning that's more of a macro message, what you're talking about. And again, very important. Are there specific things about how we should try to inculcate desire? Should these be taught as well?
Again, I don't want to focus just on the Chatan and Kala, because I see couples who are married 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, throughout the life cycle dealing with desire discrepancies. And I think we have to give the Chatan and Kala a chance to, and by the way, it's really interesting because a lot of Chatanim and Kalot, if they're coming to you a few months after and they're saying, where's the desire? I will ask them, when did you feel desire? And if they were not Shomer, that's where they felt the desire. I felt the desire when we were dating and we broke Shomer, or we did engage, and there was a knowledge that we were not going to go all the way. When we weren't having sexual intercourse, when there was a very specific need to stop, like we had to keep the brakes on. And when we had to keep the brakes on, that is what kind of lessened the anxiety and allowed for this experience of pleasure. And so being able to reconstruct that, reenact that, is usually very helpful as an intervention for these couples.
How do you reconstruct that once they're married? How do you do that?
Well, just because you're married doesn't mean that you can't put brakes, that you can't put boundaries. Let's go back to this idea of what it felt like when you were being sensual, when you were just putting your head on his shoulder, when you hugged, or when you kissed, or when being able to go back to doing these things without this idea that this is foreplay. This is what we have to do in order to get our bodies ready for the actual event of sexual intercourse, but rather we're in the moment. We're just experiencing what we're experiencing. So for this, I want to, this is kind of like I'm giving a talk here, but I'm referencing as though I'm writing a paper. So this is where I would write a reference. Go to our mindfulness and sexual pleasure episode, where we talk about this idea. And also, as long as we're referencing, if you're listening to this and you're 20 years old or 30 years old or 40 years old, and you skipped episode 50 because it was for 50-year-old, our episode, like fine wine, it doesn't matter what your age is, listen to that episode anyway, because a lot of these ideas of how to have great sex, how to increase your desire for sex are in that episode.
Tali, that definitely gives a lot of information for people who are looking for ways to enhance that desire. But if they don't feel like going back to that episode just yet, and they'd like some other practical tips that you can suggest right now, could you give some practical suggestions to a husband and a wife, no matter what their age, of ways to create that desire where it may be lacking or may not be as strong as they'd like?
Okay, so look, I think that like anything else, sex will not just happen spontaneously. So being able to be aware of how to find the time to be together and create that and schedule time to be together for intimacy. And people will say there's always some pushback. We want sex to be spontaneous, but here you are in my office. So obviously that's not working for you. If we want things to happen, we need to schedule them, we need to plan them, and it doesn't necessarily need to take away from the eroticism. In fact, it can even build up the eroticism. If you are stressed, if you are anxious, you want to be able to work on your relaxation and getting yourself relaxed, being aware of your own need to relax. It's not your partner's job to soothe or relax you, but being able to self-regulate and self-soothe in your life with warm showers or baths or yoga or listening to music or taking walks or meditation, and being able to kind of show up and regulate your own stress so that you are more available for this kind of activity, which requires you to be somewhat relaxed. People think that sex is exciting, exciting, exciting. And it does get to that point of excitement, but you need to be able to start out at some point of relaxation in order to be able to let the sensations in, knowing how to deep breathe, knowing how to really be mindful and feeling those sensations without necessarily thinking about what's next, being able to appreciate touch just for the sake of touch and talking to each other about what kind of touch you'd like to try, because recognizing that there are different levels of touch and you both might be at different levels to begin with. One partner might be at a level where they're ready for erotic touch, but you're nowhere near ready for erotic touch. And so the person who is less ready for erotic touch needs to be able to communicate that to their partner. So scheduling intimacy, creating goals of pleasure and connection instead of having these goals of reaching orgasm or having intercourse, knowing that you can stop whenever you want. If there is a physical issue, deal with it. Try to get more sleep. Give yourself time. Those are all really important tips that I would add. Just from a relational level, I would say, let's start listening to each other. Stop pathologizing each other. There's nothing wrong with you, most likely. There's no real big problem that you have. And, you're telling each other stories for the most part, unless there really is an issue. I'm not saying that there never is. There may actually be some issues, but for the most part, just because your partner doesn't want to have sex as often as you would like to have sex, it doesn't mean that they have a pathology and vice versa, that, your partner's a sex addict who's obsessed with sex. If your partner does say, I need sex every day, or I need sex twice a day, well, obviously your job is not to be a pacifier for your husband's need. If they need sex, that needs to be kind of unpacked. Like, what is that about? What does that need? And just in general, just so that the single biggest turnoff for women is, I need you. I need sex with you. I need to have you right now. And men are really kind of surprised to hear that because they think that it's really flattering. Aren't you flattered that I need you so much? But women don't really generally respond to that. They have too many people who need them already. They don't want to be needed, but they do want to be wanted. They want to be desired. And so do men.
Okay. This is unsolicited. You did not ask me to say this, Tali, but I think a lot of the information you're talking about now is said in greater detail in your wonderful book that you co-wrote with Dr. David Ribner, I Am for My Beloved. So we'll include a link to that in the show notes as well.
Thank you for that plug.
But it absolutely is a wonderful book that deals with these issues of desire in many different ways. So I highly recommend that. Tali, we're almost out of time, but let me ask you a question that maybe this will get into the relational in a way that you don't want to. So if you don't want to go there, just let me know. But we've been speaking.
I'm always happy to go there.
Okay. So we've been talking largely about discrepancies when one partner wants sex more or less than the other. When neither partner is particularly interested, when both are happy not having sex, maybe at all, or with any frequency, however that's defined, at what point would that represent something which they have to look into? Is the fact, in other words, that they're happy with the way things are, is there a red flag that they're ignoring and it might later on creep up? Or if they're happy with it, that's fine. You can continue that way.
I mean, that's really interesting. I don't think that I can answer that question on a macro level. You're probably describing avoidant couples, because couples who are quote unquote happy without sex are usually couples who are just kind of avoiding, they're conflict avoidant, and they just kind of continue this way. And sometimes it does explode at some point. But there might be couples that, for whatever their own individual reasons, they don't have as much of a need for sex and they're happy without it. And that's certainly not anybody's business. I don't think it's a problem if it's not a problem for them. In fact, in general, we talk more about sexual dysfunction, not so much in terms of dysfunction, but in terms of distress. It's only really a problem if it's distressful. And there is one other thing that I did want to bring up, and that is, there's something very lonely in what I talked about before about the wife who says to her husband, okay, fine, let's just have sex, do what you want to do. There's something very lonely for the partner who is not aroused and not enjoying sex when the partner is aroused and enjoying sex. But there's also something very, very lonely for the partner who's enjoying sex and their partner's not at all enjoying it. And I think it's really important that you're able to talk about that loneliness with each other, because that's really what the pain is about when couples do come in around discrepancies in sex or difficulties around sex, is this feeling of not being understood. And the reason why people don't feel understood is because the high desire partner is feeling rejected, and the lower desire partner is feeling guilty and is feeling burdened, and is also sometimes not really able, because of that guilt, to provide the empathy to her partner. In other words, you don't have to have sex. If you don't want to have sex, you should never have sex against your will. Again, go back to the episode on consent about what to do when you're in that kind of liminal space between, I could take it or leave it. Should I push myself to do it? What are the ways? It's basically about how can I put my foot on the accelerator when I'm kind of relaxing here on the brake pedal, and what are the motivating factors? And is that really consensual? Do I want to want? Can I make myself want? Go back to that episode, because that's always there for you. But there are times where you're not going to want to have sex, and that's okay. You never have to have sex when you don't want to have sex. But what can you do? You can be empathic to your partner who wants it, because it's very hard for him or her. It's very hard for the partner who wants it when the other person doesn't. What people tend to sometimes do is, from a place of defensiveness, say, what's wrong with you? We just did it the other day. Why would you want to do it again? And that feels very rejecting. And instead, to be able to say, wow, I'm really glad that you want to do it again. That feels really nice to me. And I'm not ready yet, but maybe we can revisit this in a couple days. So being able to respond to your partner with empathy for their higher desire for eroticism, even if it's not there for you, that's really important. That can make a real difference in the relationship.
Well, Tali, you really took the lion's share of the work today, so I appreciate your preparing this very, very informative episode. And I learned a lot, as I always do, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. So thank you for teaching all of us. And thank all of you for listening to this episode of Intimate Judaism. And again, welcome back to our 6th season. We have a lot of good episodes planned, and we're looking forward to having you join us on this journey this year. Thanks for listening.
Bye.